That's my fangirl scream. I'm just so happy that Elden Ring is coming out. Okay, like From Software is my favorite game developers. I love the Souls games. I love Bloodborne. I love Sekiro. Sure, some are better than others, but I love all of them. Elden Ring is my most anticipated game for years. It better be good. Anyway. However, From Software has also had some issues with their PC ports not always being perfect. They've gotten better in more recent years, but like going back to Dark Souls 1, there was some serious issues with that. So anyway, we'll see what we can see. Now what we've got today is, well, apparently on the Steam page, well, first of all, just if you didn't know, game's coming out on February 24th. I'm so excited. Anyway, on the Steam page, apparently, we've got the system requirements, except that they're not showing up for me. Now, why do I say that they should be here? Well, I got a notification because everything tracks you. Google must know that I constantly Google search the system requirements for Elden Ring because I do that on a daily basis. Don't you guys? Anyway. So I got a notification saying that, hey, they're up. Now, this is an article that I'll link in the description of my video from Games Radar, and they're saying that the PC requirements are here, although it's just the minimum system requirements, and they said that they found them on the Steam page. So I went ahead and checked the Steam page, and they're not there. So this does bring up an issue we need to discuss. If these were somehow incorrect and get replaced or updated, then I will do an updated video and you'll find it here. I'll link the little point you to my next video thing up there on the YouTube thing. So if that's there, click that because that's gonna be more up to date than what you're watching now. Anyway, also, I want to say that if you're like, okay, you read the system specs and you just like bounce out of the video, I mean, good. I mean, do what you want to do. But I'm going to give you a lot of thoughts on these are just the minimum system requirements, and they don't tell us what resolution or frame rate we think these are targeting. I'm going to tell you some info that, some good speculation. It's not baseless speculation, some good ideas on what I think this is targeting. I'm also going to help you understand how your CPU and your GPU might compare to this, okay? Also, I'll just point out quickly before we get to the more interesting stuff, the RAM here is 12 gigabytes, and apparently this is the minimum requirements. Most games' minimums are still 8 gigabytes of RAM, and so I would expect the recommended to even jump to 16. That's pretty normal, but just a heads up that this is more RAM than a lot of minimum requirement games are. So if you're still on an older system and you still have 8 gigabytes of RAM, I mean, a 16 gigabyte kit's about $50 these days. Could just upgrade. Anyway, and the storage is at 60 gigabytes, so make sure you have space for that. It doesn't specify SSD, although I'll just tell you right now, if you don't have an SSD, you should just get an SSD, guys. They're not that expensive these days, and it makes your computer just night and day different. Anyway, let me talk about what I think this is actually targeting before we get into what are all the specific details. So it doesn't tell us, but I think that this is 1080p at low or medium settings, probably low settings, and not 60 FPS. I also don't think it's going to be locked to 30 FPS. I think you'll do better than 30 FPS. I just think you're going to fall short of 60 FPS. Doesn't mean there won't be easier to run scenes where you'll get to 60 FPS, but I do not think this is going to be a locked 60 FPS. Speaking of a locked 60 FPS, that's another thing that we should talk about. Apparently the game has a frame rate limit of 60 frames per second. And we see this in a lot of From Software games. In fact, if I remember correctly, the original Dark Souls was actually a 30 FPS lock, even on PC. And that I've heard, although I don't know the details, that their engine might even have issues when it runs higher than its capped frame rate. So I would expect there to probably be mods that unlock the frame rate limit of 60 FPS. But I would also want to double check that that doesn't mess up anything about the game if you do run it at higher than 60 FPS. Also, I do know that the game has will have ray tracing support. They've said that they'll update it in a patch, but at launch, the game will not have ray tracing support. I've also not heard anything about FSR or DLSS, so let's get all that out of the way. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if when they patch in ray tracing, if they might also patch in DLSS and or FSR, or hey, maybe even Intel's XeSS. Who knows? But anyway, let's get all that out of the way. Now, why do I think that this is going to be almost but not quite 60, like maybe, in the 40s or so on average? Well, if we look up, and I'll link this as well, This is a Destructoid article that's quoting a page of system requirements info. By the way, this is backing up what I just said. PC is up to 4K and up to 60 frames per second. Notice it doesn't say unlocked. It does have HDR support if you have a supported display, and ray tracing will be added via a patch. Okay, now here's what I'm getting at. So the PlayStation 4, the base model PlayStation 4, is going to run the game at up to 30 frames per second. You heard that, up to 30 frames per second, meaning they actually expect the game to dip below 30 frames per second. And also it runs at up to 1080p. And notice that the Xbox One S is only up to 900p, not even up to 1080p, and up to 30 frames per second. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that the minimum GPU being the GTX 1060. Now notice that they throw in the 3GB version on here, by the way. So good news for anybody who has the 3GB version. They are saying that one could be used. And the RX 580, they are saying the 4GB version should be fine. You don't need the 8GB version. But anyway, what I'm getting at here is that on a lot of the recent PS4 games that came to PC with ports, the GTX 1060 tends to do, and this is really hand wavy, and every game is different, so don't jump on me too hard on this in the comment section, but they tend to get about double the frame rate that the PS4 does on the GTX 1060. Okay, about double the frame rate. So what I'm saying is, if the PS4 is having to resolution scale, that's what up to means. It means it won't even always run at 1080p. It'll render below 1080p to try to get to 30 frames per second if it needs to, right? And it looks like the Xbox One S is only going up to 900p. So I would expect dips below 1080p to be the norm, not the exception. And that's to get up to 30 frames per second. So that's why I think that if the 1060 is going to be double that performance, then that means that a lot of times to hit 30 FPS, the console won't even be at 1080p. Or in other words, if the PS4 was at 1080p, it would be below 30 FPS. So if you double a number that's less than 30, you are not at 60. That's all I'm saying. So that's why I think that these minimum requirements are targeting a number that is higher than 30, but is less than 60 at 1080p at whatever the PS4 equivalent settings are, which I would imagine to be pretty low considering this is a PS5 game as well that's supposed to be fairly demanding. And again, I would expect similar performance on the RX 580. So that's what I think these are targeting. And since I had it up there, we could also just kind of go ahead and say the PS4 Pro, by the way, looks like it'll go up to 1800p, but I believe this one means that there's checkerboard rendering. But that's still only up to 30 FPS, up to, right? And the PS5 will run the game at 4K at up to 60 FPS, but I believe the 2 here is a note that means that that's a performance mode. So yeah, I think it can go up to 4K, but if you're running in performance mode, I don't think it'll be running at 60 FPS. That's how I would read that. And then the looks like the Xbox One X will go up to 4K, up to 30 FPS. The Series S is going up to 1440p and up to 60 FPS. Again, that's a 2, which means that's going down into performance mode in order to hit 60. So I don't think you'd be at 1440p 60 on a Series S. I think it'll probably be rendering lower than 1440p. And the Series X will go up to 4K and again up to 60 FPS, but that's only in performance mode. So that's another thing. As we look into the system requirements here, it's looking like the high-end version of the game running on your Series X and your PS5 is probably actually going to be like a dynamic 4K that's targeting 30 FPS would be my guess. And your 60 FPS mode is running at a significantly lower resolution. So with that in mind, I'm going to say that to actually run this game on a PC at maximum settings and a high graphic settings and high frame rates, high resolutions, I think you're gonna need a pretty beefy system in order to do that. Also, if you're wondering why would this game be so much more demanding than previous From Software titles like Sekiro being the most recent one, I I think it's, well, for one thing, due to the open world, and then for the other reason being, well, it is also targeting the newer generation of consoles as well. Okay, so where does your hardware fall in relation to this stuff? Well, let's take a quick look at the CPUs. So these aren't like the latest and greatest, but they're also not the oldest, so you might have something weaker than this. The i5-8400 is a 6-core, 6-thread processor from October of 2017. So it's not super old, and this is their minimum system requirements here. So I would say that you could fall short of this, and I don't know what to expect if you do when it comes to performance. And the AMD Ryzen 3 3300X, which is the AMD recommendation here, is only 4-core, 8-thread, although it's a newer chip. It's from 2020. But generally in gaming performance, due to single thread performance, instructions per cycle or whatever it is, AMD CPUs in this generation tended to lag behind their Intel counterparts. So this is probably actually only maybe catching up to your 8400, even though it's significantly newer. But don't quote me on that exact detail. But what I'm getting at here is these are fairly new CPUs that it's recommending. So if you're on a really older CPU, you might have some issues, and you'll want to look at how you compare to these, or wait for benchmarks of the game when it releases. Now, GPU-wise, the GTX 1060, although I just realized we're talking about the 3GB version, I've got the 6GB selected on this chart, but anyway. If we set that as a baseline of 100%, you can now see where your GPU kind of falls in relation to this, right? So if you're on like a GTX 970, that's not really too far off from the 1060, especially the 3GB version of the 1060, since the 970 has 3.5GB of usable memory. So I would imagine that even though a 970 is below a 1060 and the 1060 is listed as the minimum, I think you'll still be able to play the game just fine on a 970 would be my prediction. Same thing as you drop down a bit, but as you get down to things that are significantly weaker, like a GTX 1650 or a 1050 Ti, I think that you're still going to be able to play the game because, like I said, I think the 1060 is going to do better than 30 FPS. It's just not hitting 60, so it'll fall in between. So I think these weaker cards are really going to be struggling for that 30 FPS average. And then as we get below this point, you might have to go below 1080p, right? If you're on your like GTX 1050, that kind of thing. And you might be dipping below 30 FPS as well. Now, I think you're going to need a significantly stronger GPU. I think you might want to have at least a 1070 to maybe lock that 1080p 60 FPS. Again, this is all my speculation based on everything I said at the beginning of the video. And then I think you want to be stronger than that, right? If you want to jump up to 1440p or increase the graphics settings, right? And so I think that, your 2060 and your 1080, it is a significant jump over that minimum, but I think this will just be like turning up settings and maybe getting to 60 FPS at 1080p. I think to have good higher settings at 1440p, we're probably going to be needing to jump at least to this 3060 2070 level, and that might not even be maxed out settings. I think you might even want to be getting up a little bit higher, to have a maxed out 1440p. This is all a lot of speculation, though. And I've got to say, based on what we saw and how I think the consoles are going to perform, where was that? Based on how the top-end consoles are performing at 4K, which like I said, I think is going to be more like a 4K 30, I really think that if you're looking for a 4K experience on this game, you're going to want to be top of the charts here with your RTX 3080 or 6800 XT probably for a solid 4K experience. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not even going to guarantee that's going to be maxed out at 60 FPS. And that's before we even get into their ray tracing patch and all that coming in the future. All right, guys, hopefully you guys found this interesting. And like I said, I will update this video if we get more information. And man, I am so excited for this game. Have an excellent day.